So, propriety in the use of the gifts, verse 14:26 to 40. In this section of 1 Corinthians 14, Paul drew to a conclusion his discussion of gifts, chapters 12 to 14. He also concluded the whole section dealing with Christian liberty in relation to worship, 11:2 to 14:40. What is most striking to a modern reader is the apparent lack of any fixed order of service and the absence of any reference to a particular individual being responsible for specific ministries to keep this thing in an orderly way. It's almost like God was leading it, and he was. The whole church seemed to exercise their gifts by spontaneously ministering to one another. Wow. You don't see that. Everybody's sitting there quiet and then structured by a service book and monotone, unimaginative, and very unspiritual. 14:26. As he had done throughout the letter, Paul addressed the Christian community in Corinth as brothers, a general term including both sexes. When the church met, anyone was free to participate by contributing a hymn or a word of instruction, probably a lesson based on the Old Testament, a revelation from one gifted in prophecy, or a word from one gifted in a tongue followed by an interpretation of what was said, men and women. The controlling principle in this free participation was the rule of love. All that was said and done was to have as its goal the need of strengthening, edifying others. 27. If anyone speaks in a tongue, it should be by two or more at most three, and each in turn, and one must interpret. You don't need a pastor and teacher to call for these things. So to clarify relative to tongues, Paul stipulates, if anyone speaks in a tongue, a known language, warning specifically to those who speak in that known language, relative to turning back to God to avoid turning temporal punishment. It should be by two or at the most three, and each in turn, and one must interpret. So the one speaking in tongues, those speaking in tongues, better know what's going on in their congregation. You got someone believing Jews in their congregation that don't speak your local languages? Stand up and be counted. Notice that if there is no interpreter available, the tongue speaker must keep silent while in the church, and thus it is implied that the tongue speaker must discern whether or not there is a tongues interpreter present before he begins to speak in a tongue. Whereupon Paul wrote that if there were no interpreter present, and let him speak to himself and to God, in the sense of let him keep it to himself and to God, since there is no one present in church, or elsewhere for that matter, where there is an interpreter, who is with you, and an unbelieving Jew or Jews, who do not speak your native language, but a language you did not previously know. And you better make sure of this, in order to interpret, authenticate your message, so that unbelieving Jews or Jews in order, Jews in order to make sure that that message in a foreign language actually did come from God, and it is properly interpreted. See? We don't have to check these things out. These things happen naturally, according to the Holy Spirit, which the individual who received their message from God also understands and may be edified. Of course, God does not need one to speak tongues to him. He gave you that message, if it indeed came from the Holy Spirit. So, in the absence of an interpreter, the revelation in tongues is between oneself and God, if it came from God. But in the absence of an interpreter, there is certainly a question of the message in tongues being authentic. You all are speaking once. I went to Shady Grove Church in Texas, and boy, what a chaotic service that was. I wanted to leave, but out of respect for the man that brought me, I didn't. Here's 1 Corinthians 14:27-28 Bible Knowledge Commentary. Though there was no established order for a service, it was to be conducted in an orderly way. The services were to have balanced participation on the parts of gifted members. Those gifted with a tongue who wanted to contribute to a service could do so, but only 2 or 3 at any one service, and then only if individuals gifted in interpretation were present who could translate the language. If no interpreter were present, the tongue speaker was to keep quiet. Though his gift was without benefit to the church, if uninterpreted, it did have some other benefits. 1 Corinthians 14:29. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others pass judgment. Now, on the matter of prophecy, Paul wrote, let 2 or 3 prophets speak, limiting the number, so as not to create turmoil and confusion as the Corinthian believers were evidently creating. Most of them didn't have, when they created chaos, most of them weren't gifted. They were just making it up. Maybe from their experience with ecstatic speaking in the pagan world, the pagan religions they adhered to at first. Then he wrote, and let the others in the congregation pass judgment on the validity of their message. See? So there's a lot of order here, despite the fact that there isn't some written down, written as rules of how we're going to conduct our service, which most of the denominations have, and they're very misguided. Now, this might be determined based on the fulfillment of what the prophet predicted would occur, and whether or not his message edified others. Such teaching should be heard even from one who had not been on his feet to speak. In some way, the person with this revelation was a spokesman for God in giving some edifying message to the church. The spirits of the prophets and the spirits of the prophets themselves, who were guided by the Holy Spirit in using this special gift. And these prophetic utterances are subject to being checked. Hypotasso, by other prophets for accuracy and orthodoxy. All this leads to the peace and order of which God is the author. And amazing. God doesn't need a pastor to organize this liturgy for every service every Sunday. We have a unity of the body. We have people not worried about their own pecking order within the church and so on. 1429, Bible Knowledge Commentary. The directions for those exercising the gift of prophecy did not suffer from those for tongues. 2 or 3 prophets could speak at each service, and what they said was to be carefully considered. Since they would speak in Greek, the others in the congregation would understand and evaluate the message. Or perhaps the others referred to those with the gift of distinguishing between spirits. The words weigh carefully translate the verb diakrinostion, related to the noun diakrisis in 12:10, which speaks of distinguishing between spirits. It was their responsibility to ascertain if the message delivered was indeed from God. But if a revelation is made to another who is seated, the first one must keep silent. And Paul stipulated that if a revelation is made by God in another member of the church who is sitting down, the first one must keep silent until it was his turn to speak after the one sitting down delivered his message. Interesting. 1430, Bible Knowledge Commentary. A prophet might have received a revelation, probably in a vision or dream, sometimes prior to the meeting of the church, at which he subsequently related it. However, a prophet might also experience a revelation during the service. If such occurred, a prophet in the midst of speaking should draw his message to a close to let the other gifted members speak. Whatever the Corinthian services were, they were not dull. For you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted. For Paul indicated that all of the members of the congregation may have an opportunity to prophesy, but they are to do it one by one, and for the purpose of edifying others in the congregation and of learning themselves as well, and thereby be exhorted, i.e. encouraged, to grow in the faith, direct from God, leading of the Holy Spirit. 1431, Bible Knowledge Commentary. The principle which regulated the exercise of tongues applied similarly to prophets, which was said to benefit everyone by way of instructions or encouragement in the Christian life. And, verse 32, and the spirits of prophets are subject to prophets. See, people just don't go speaking off and then it's not questioned. It's God, the Holy Spirit is working, making sure it's verified. and people understand that. Paul evidently is addressing the potential misuse of the spirits of the prophets, spirits in the sense of the spiritual gifts of the prophets, who the latter are supposed to be in charge of those spiritual gifts which God has given them, and not to misuse their spirits for self-centered purposes, such as to gain importance instead of edifying the body of believers, thus creating confusion instead of peace, as Paul wrote in the next verse. 1 Corinthians 14:33, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. So Paul is addressing the out-of-control behavior of the believers in Corinth, which gives others the impression that God is a God of confusion instead of a God of peace. Bible Knowledge Commentary comments, Paul apparently did not believe that the prophets were any more than restrained than their fellow members gifted in tongues. So he gave the prophets an instruction that was similar to what he gave the tongue speakers. The spirits referred to a prophet's spiritual gift, which did not control the gifted members, but he controlled it. If 2 or 3 prophets spoke in a particular service, others gifted and with something to say could do so on another occasion. The church was not a forum for personal pontification or self-glorification. It was a place where people were to be built up and God was to be honored. The service and those who took part in it should reflect the character of God. He is a God of peace, not disorder, and his Spirit worked to produce the same fruit in believers' lives. This kind of service would serve to operate much better than the controlled denominational services of today, which are manipulated by people who don't even know the gospel. Now we have 1 Corinthians 14:34-40, ending out this chapter. Commentary on 14:34-40. The women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. Whereupon Paul addresses the subject of women, that they are to keep silent in the churches, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. Compare an article by Denny Burke, Must Women Be Silent in Churches? 14:34-40. It's a good article. It's lengthy. Most Women Be Silent in Churches? 14:34. By Denny Burke. Denny Burke is a professor of biblical studies at Boise College, the undergraduate school of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He also serves as an associate pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church. The interpretation of 1 Corinthians 14:34-35 has proven to be more than a little controversial over the years. The reason for that is due in no small part to the clash that this text brings to modern egalitarian sensibilities. Paul writes, 33b, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. And if they desire to learn anything, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is improper for a woman to speak in church. What is going on in these verses? Does Paul really mean to say that women must never say anything in a worship service? That is how some people have read these verses over the years, but I think that it is a misreading of the text. Why? For starters, it would create a hopeless contradiction with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:5, which indicates that women were praying and prophesying in the church. Paul doesn't rebuke their praying and prophesying in church. On the contrary, he gives them instructions on how to do it in the right way, in a way that allows them to speak, but that at the same time honors male headship. Women prophesying in the assembly was in keeping with what Apostle Peter said was characteristic of the New Covenant Church of the Spirit predicted in Joel 2. And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth of my Spirit upon all mankind, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, Acts 2:17. Who's going to prophesy, sons and daughters? So if you take verse 34 to be an absolute prohibition on women speaking at all in a worship service, then you have adopted an interpretation that makes chapter 14 to contradict chapter 11. And that cannot be, because God cannot contradict himself. The alleged contradiction that led some interpreters to suggest that verses 14:34-35 were not really written by Paul. More on this next time.